Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Tale Untwisted, General George B. McClellan, the Maryland Campaign, and the Discovery of Lee's Lost Orders, by Gene M. Thorp and Alexander B. Rossino. Narrated by Chris Sorensen. Preface. The book you are now listening to is a greatly expanded version of an essay published as part of Savis Beattie's Civil War Spotlight series in 2019. That earlier essay, available in digital format only, focused tightly on the events of September 13, 1862, when troops with the Army of the Potomac's 12th Corps discovered a mislaid copy of Robert E. Lee's Special Orders No. 191 lying in a field near Frederick, Maryland. Passing up the chain of command, the lost orders, as they have come to be known, eventually reached General George B. McClellan, who used the information contained in them to lead his army to its fateful clash with Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at South Mountain, and shortly afterward at Antietam Creek. Publishing online presented challenges for those of the reading audience who wanted a hard copy of the essay for their Civil War book collections. We also received numerous requests for more information concerning General McClellan's direction of the Maryland campaign from the beginning of September until the eve of the South Mountain fight on September 14th. This expanded version of our study provides the new information requested and a great deal more, including sections on the historiography of the Lost Orders debate and an exploration of Civil War-era telegraphy meant to clarify where the incorrect 12M timestamp on McClellan's trophies telegram to President Lincoln on September 13th might have originated. It is our hope that this study answers many of the questions we have received from readers of the earlier digital essay. We anticipate as well that this study will clear up flawed interpretations of the evidence that historians and others have used over the years to unjustly criticize McClellan's performance in Maryland. Had the general not risen to the task and provided the shattered Federal Army in the East with capable leadership, the United States as it existed might have permanently ceased to be. Defeating Lee north of the Potomac in September 1862 saved the Union at its moment of greatest peril, and George B. McClellan deserves praise, not condemnation, for having accomplished it. Gene M. Thorp and Alexander B. Rossino, Glenwood and Boonesboro, Maryland, September 2021. I have thus far abstained from any public reply to the various criticisms and misrepresentations of which I have been the subject, and shall probably preserve the same attitude during the remainder of my life. Certainly, up to within a brief period, party feeling has run so high that the pathway for the truth has been well nigh closed, and too many have preferred to accept blindly whatever was most agreeable to their prejudices, rather than to examine facts. I have, therefore, been able to maintain a calm front under abuse, and, while far from claiming immunity from error, have remained satisfied with the conviction that, after my death at least, my countrymen will recognize the fact that I loyally served my country in its darkest hour. Major General George Brinton McClellan, November 8, 1881. 4 years before his death. Chapter 1. How We Got Here. The history of writing about George McClellan and Lee's Special Orders No. 191. Every so often, one of the American Civil War's most enduring controversies erupts into public awareness, stirring renewed debate among historians and enthusiasts alike. One of those controversies is whether Major General George Brinton McClellan, commander of the Army of the Potomac, dawdled after receiving a mislaid copy of Robert E. Lee's Special Orders No. 191 on September 13, 1862. The lost orders were discovered in a field southeast of Frederick, Maryland, 3 days after Confederate troops marched out on September 10th, providing McClellan with Lee's operational plan for the capture of Harper's Ferry. The lost orders, as they have come to be known, clarified to McClellan the meaning of various pieces of information that had been coming in for several days from Governor Andrew Curtin of Pennsylvania, General Alfred Pleasonton's cavalry, President Abraham Lincoln, and the War Department in Washington. These disparate sources painted a jumbled and often conflicting picture of rebel movements, with some stating that Confederate columns had been spotted in Hagerstown, while others said rebel troops were crossing the Potomac River back into Virginia at Williamsport. With Lee's orders in his hands, all these scattered bits now made sense to McClellan. He understood that Lee had split his army into multiple columns, that taking Harper's Ferry was Lee's immediate objective, and that the opportunity had presented itself to destroy the separated parts of the Army of Northern Virginia in detail. This information enabled Little Mac, as many of the men in his army fondly called him, to devise a plan for attacking Confederate forces at the gaps in South Mountain. Federal troops with the 6th, 9th, and 1st Corps did exactly this on September 14th, successfully driving Lafayette McLaws, James Longstreet's, and Daniel Harvey Hill's portions of the rebel army back toward Virginia, effectively wrecking Lee's plans. Yet, despite the passage of more than a century and a half, debate about the steps McClellan took, or failed to take, continues to swirl. Exactly when this controversy began and why it has persisted for so long are fascinating tales in themselves, because it is the things written about the lost orders over the years that first fanned the flames of controversy into life and which keeps them burning to this day. Thanks to leaks from the Army of the Potomac, or possibly the War Department, information about the discovery of Special Orders No. 191 first appeared in major newspapers within days after McClellan had received them. The Washington Star reported on September 15, 1862, that a member of Colonel Colgrove's regiment found a paper purporting to be Rebel Order No. 119. Although someone clearly leaked this information, there does not appear to have been any explicit political intrigue connected with it. Indeed, politics did not figure into the picture until 1863, after George McClellan himself attempted to defend his actions during the Maryland campaign by passing a copy of the orders to his friend William Cowper Prime. Prime, the editor-in-chief of the New York Journal of Commerce, a newspaper critical of the Lincoln administration's handling of the war, published the orders on January 1, 1863. McClellan then testified in March of that year before the Congressional Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War that he had been handed Lee's orders at Frederick. This news became public in April with the release of the committee's official report. But while criticism of McClellan by the committee certainly provided the backdrop for these events, no controversy erupted concerning his handling of Special Orders No. 191. Just the opposite occurred as the committee, being more interested in the conduct of the Peninsular Campaign and allegations that McClellan had not done enough to support John Pope before the Battle of Second Bull Run, made barely any inquiries about the conduct of the Maryland campaign. To all intents and purposes, the discovery of the lost orders proved to be a non-issue. This might have remained the state of affairs had two important events not occurred. The announcement in October 1863 that McClellan intended to run for president on the Democratic ticket in 1864, and the publication in February 1864 of a 480-page report written by McClellan defending his time as the Army of the Potomac's commanding officer. Intended to justify the decisions he had made and rebut accusations that had surfaced during the radical Republican-controlled Joint Committee hearings, McClellan recounted succinctly in his report that, on the 13th of September 1862, an order fell into my hands issued by General Lee, which fully disclosed his plans. This bland statement of fact might have gone unnoticed had McClellan not followed it up with the assertion that he immediately gave orders for a rapid and vigorous forward movement to save the endangered Federal garrison at Harper's Ferry. This claim contradicted on-the-record comments made by General-in-Chief of the Army Henry W. Halleck before a military commission investigating the circumstances surrounding Harper's Ferry's fall in September 1862. Testifying that, after having received orders to repel the enemy invading the state of Maryland, McClellan marched only 6 miles per day on an average when pursuing this invading enemy. Halleck implied that the general had been guilty of foot-dragging when the relief of Harper's Ferry required swift action. To this Halleck added, in his opinion, he, McClellan, could and should have relieved and protected Harper's Ferry, a statement with which the commission said it fully concurred. In other words, the accusation of tardiness that subsequently became a hallmark of Little Mac criticism started with Henry W. Halleck in an effort to shift blame from himself for the disaster that befell Colonel Dixon S. Miles and his men at Harper's Ferry. Halleck proved so successful at contriving this bit of subterfuge against McClellan that even President Lincoln shared the belief, telling Senator Orville Hickman Browning in November 1862 that McClellan could and ought to have prevented the loss of Harper's Ferry, but was 6 days marching 40 miles, and it was surrendered. The release of McClellan's report lit a bonfire of public criticism, prompting William Swinton, a wartime correspondent for the New York Times, to pursue a literary scorched earth campaign against the now Democratic Party presidential candidate. Swinton railed mercilessly against McClellan's command decisions in a series of articles published by the Times from February through April 1864. These screeds, published as a collective by the Radical Republican Union Congressional League under the provocative title McClellan's Military Career Reviewed and Exposed, the military policy of the administration set forth and vindicated, made it clear from the onset that Swinton did not intend his critique to be an honest comment on military policy. Rather, he contrived from the very beginning to influence the outcome of the presidential race, arguing in the first sentence of his first column that General McClellan, having won whatever reputation he enjoys in the field of war, is now running on this reputation as the presidential candidate of a party whose creed is peace. He will only be certain of being president of our country when it is certain we have no country at all. Turning to the general's lengthy report, Swinton lambasted it as an elaborate political manifesto produced by a man struck by the fever of the White House while his soldiers were being struck down by thousands with the fevers of the Chickahominy. McClellan sought to vindicate his conduct and arraign the administration in his so-called report, argued Swinton, demanding a critical analysis of the document out of concern for the welfare of the country not less than the truth of history. Swinton self-righteously dedicated himself to this task, promising to pierce the historical truth underlying the veneer which General McClellan has spread over events, to endeavor to seize by the guiding clue of unpublished dispatches how much here set down as original motive is really afterthought, and to examine the foundation of the charges which he heaps upon the administration. If I do not succeed in providing by documentary evidence that every one of General McClellan's failures was the result of his own conduct and character, if I do not prove his career as a whole to have been a failure unmatched in military history, and if I do not fasten upon him conduct which in any other country in the world would have caused him to be court-martialed and dismissed the service, I shall ask the reader to accept his plea in abatement of judgment and accord him the patent of distinguished generalship. Following this declaration of intent, Swinton proceeded to develop the disparaging portrayal of McClellan's flaws and failed decisions that remains with us to this day. He dissected McClellan's claims from the Peninsula Campaign about the overwhelming strength of the enemy, while minimizing the number of his own men, accusing the general of producing a series of winnings and whimperings for troops, the most extraordinary ever put on record. Swinton questioned McClellan's complaints about the weather hindering his operations, and statements that the men of his army were neither disciplined enough nor sufficiently well trained to take the field. He outlined McClellan's refusal to promptly execute orders, accused him of foot-dragging, described his reluctance to bring on engagements, and argued that after the reverse experienced outside of Richmond, McClellan brought back an army demoralized, worn down by useless toil, and reduced by sickness, almost unmatched in the annals of war. To all of this Swinton added the undermining of John Pope, closing with the statement that while he had hitherto questioned McClellan's capacity as a commander, the failure to support Pope called into question even the general's loyalty to the nation. Turning finally to the Maryland campaign, Swinton pontificated that it was not his purpose to review it in detail, his true aim being not so much to dissect the historical facts themselves as to dissect General McClellan's character and conduct. We are presented with the same characteristics of genius and generalship which we have already discovered, the same unreadiness to move promptly and act vigorously, the same clamoring for more troops before advancing, the same reference to the great superiority of numbers on part of the enemy. It is, after all, a dismal story, and has probably already tested the human stomach to its utmost limits. When Swinton came to the discovery of Special Orders No. 191, he called Lee's operation against Harper's Ferry bold, arguing, "The rebel general should have been made to pay dearly for venturing upon it." And yet, if we consider that the combinations of a commander are necessarily largely influenced by his knowledge of the character of his opponent, we must admit that Lee, aware of the tardy genius of McClellan, was authorized in taking a step which, against a vigorous opponent, ought to have secured his destruction. At any rate, the event fully justified his action. McClellan, entrusted with the duty of meeting and crushing the invading army, moved out by slow and easy stages, at an average of 6 miles a day, and accommodated Lee with all the time he needed. Of course, he was able to accomplish his designed object, the capture of Harper's Ferry, its garrisons and stores. Here we find Swinton airing the first public reproach of McClellan's handling of the lost orders. Those familiar with the Maryland campaign will recognize the many elements of the story that have become hallmarks as it has been passed down. Swinton claimed that Lee made his plans based on an assessment of McClellan's timidity, including a word-for-word recitation of the accusation hurled by Halleck that McClellan's advance averaged only 6 miles per day. Never mind that in the campaign's early phase McClellan marched the exhausted remnants of John Pope's army north 30 to 40 miles to cover Washington and Baltimore, or that as it approached Frederick, the Ninth Corps' columns actually marched at twice the daily rate asserted by Halleck. Swinton never asked about any of that. The journalist turned military expert found it easier to cherry-pick Halleck's statement and use it against McClellan rather than verify the details. After all, and this is important to remember, Swinton did not intend to seek the truth. His New York Times columns represented little more than an openly declared effort to assassinate the character of Abraham Lincoln's political opponent in the upcoming election. Worse yet, Swinton claimed that the moment Lee crossed the Potomac, the forces at Harper's Ferry were placed in a false position and should have been promptly withdrawn. but we find no recommendation to this effect by General McClellan during the period in which it was possible to carry it out. In other words, he made the entire story debacle at Harper's Ferry George McClellan's responsibility, despite the fact that as commander of the Army of the Potomac, McClellan did not receive the required authority from Halleck to issue orders to Colonel Miles until September 12th, only 3 days before Miles surrendered. Never mind either that at the end of its proceedings, the Harper's Ferry Military Commission investigating the debacle concluded that Colonel Miles' incapacity, amounting to almost imbecility, led to the shameful surrender of this important post. Harper's Ferry, as well as Maryland Heights, was prematurely surrendered. Halleck's effort to cover up his own blunders thus proved to be spectacularly successful thanks to his use of McClellan as a scapegoat and William Swinton's enthusiasm as a radical Republican attack dog. Unfortunately for Little Mac, the politically motivated broadsides fired by Swinton would not be the last heard from him concerning the lost orders. Styling himself a scholar after the war, Swinton published a history of the Army of the Potomac in 1866. In this work, the fledgling military historian revealed his own duplicity by changing the thrust of his critique. Reading somewhere along the line that Lee had said McClellan advanced his army more rapidly than was convenient during the campaign, thereby disrupting his plans, the Federal commander suddenly acted with energy, but not with the impetuosity called for. If he had thrown forward his army with the vigor used by Jackson in his advance on Harper's Ferry, the passes of South Mountain would have been carried before the evening of the 13th, at which time they were very feebly guarded, and then debauching into Pleasant Valley, the Union commander might next morning have fallen upon the rear of McLaws at Maryland Heights, and relieved Harper's Ferry, which did not surrender till the morning of the 15th. But he did not arrive at South Mountain until the morning of the 14th, and by that time the Confederates, forewarned of his approach, had recalled a considerable force to dispute the passage. Now, therefore, McClellan moved fast in response to reading Lee's orders, but just not fast enough, and as a result, the Confederate Army was able to defend the South Mountain passes in time to capture Harper's Ferry. The failure on McClellan's part suddenly became the fact that he did not attack the South Mountain gaps quickly enough, a variation of the slow-marching accusation that Swinton had made so much of in 1864, but which now held little water in light of Lee's published comment. Despite these subtle changes in his condemnation, and knowing Lee's opinion of McClellan's industry during the campaign, Swinton never offered a retraction of the slander he had penned in 1864 to influence the outcome of the presidential election. Those deliberate and malicious misrepresentations lived on unchallenged. Following Swinton, another writer, the talented Renaissance man John W. Draper, picked up the twisted tale of Special Orders No. 191. A scientist, photographer, and physician, Draper included the subject in a multi-volume history of the American Civil War that he published in 1868. In this work, he claimed, without offering a detailed elaboration, that after obtaining the orders, McClellan had it in his power on the 14th to have overwhelmed the division of the Confederate General McLaws and relieve Harper's Ferry. This time, though, the failure was not McClellan dawdling. It was that instead of attacking McLaws' command, the general followed the main body of the Confederates toward South Mountain, for they lingered in their march to give time for the reduction of Harper's Ferry. Making such a statement amounted to damning with faint praise, because while Draper praised McClellan for acting decisively, he also criticized him for moving in the wrong direction. Curious in regard to Draper's history at this point in his apparent ignorance of Swinton's history from 2 years earlier. Neither mentioning nor citing Swinton, Draper appears to have arrived at his own conclusion concerning Little Mac's handling of the lost orders, and, while he did not applaud the general's effort, he at least acknowledged action on McClellan's part based on an independent reading of the sources. Swinton's and Draper's interpretations of the event remained the most prominent until the appearance in 1876 of a history of the war written by Louis-Philippe d'Orléans, otherwise known as the Comte de Paris. A Frenchman who had served on McClellan's staff during the war, d'Orléans also turned out to be a skilled and even-handed historian. He blamed Colonel Miles for shutting himself up at Harper's Ferry instead of retiring out of harm's way, and wrote of the lost orders that while they provided a splendid opportunity for McClellan, the danger at the same time was imminent. For it was evident that Miles, of whom the Federals had heard nothing more, was allowing himself to be hemmed in on the right bank of the Potomac. It was necessary, therefore, on the one hand to prevent the capture of Harper's Ferry, and on the other to attack the Confederate army before it should be able to reunite. Little Mac rose to this challenge, according to d'Orléans, as Federal troops immediately took up their line of march toward Middletown, while Franklin, bearing to southwestward with the left, was to carry the pass of Crampton's Gap, proceed rapidly down Pleasant Valley on the track of McLaws, attack the latter vigorously with all his forces, rescue the garrison of Harper's Ferry, and finally, without losing a moment, taking this garrison with him, overtake the rest of the army through Roarsville. The French Count then took time in his analysis to address Little Mac's critics, particularly those who claimed the general had advanced too slowly. Writing that these voices might perhaps blame McClellan for having lost a few hours in the execution of this plan, to which the incapacity of the defenders of Harper's Ferry was to give a decided importance, d'Orléans argued, instead of condemning so trifling a delay, we feel convinced that impartial history will render justice to the really extraordinary results he obtained through his activity, the precision of his orders, and the prestige of his name in leading to the pursuit of a victorious enemy the routed bands he had rallied 10 days before in sight of the capital. He could not make them march with the regularity of tried veterans, nor could his lieutenants, notwithstanding their zeal, always conform strictly to the orders he gave them. It followed that Sumner, on the evening of the 13th, had not left Frederick, that only a single corps of the right wing, Reno's, had reached Middletown, while the greater portion of the left wing was still on the banks of the Monocacy. The execution of the great movement, in fact, was only commenced on the morning of the 14th. These movements resulted in the capture of the South Mountain Gaps and a reverse for Lee's army. Outcomes, the Frenchmen concluded, representing an important success for McClellan that restored confidence to his soldiers and opened to him at the same time the entrance to the valley of the Antietam, where he hoped to strike his adversary before Jackson should have returned from Harper's Ferry. If he had been able to begin the battle sooner, he would have inflicted upon Hill, who was isolated, a much more serious reverse, and by obtaining control of the South Mountain passes before night, he would have definitely prevented the junction of his adversaries. But the Federal general could not foresee the failures which were to result in the premature surrender of Harper's Ferry, and he had reason to felicitate himself upon the result achieved and the unquestionable victory he had just obtained. Although in writing these words d'Orléans could be accused of making excuses, the Count freely admitted that McClellan could have started his advance earlier. At the same time, he also gently placed blame for the Harper's Ferry disaster squarely on the shoulders of Dixon Miles for surrendering prematurely. This represented a significant departure from portrayals of the events thus far because it exonerated McClellan for the fall of Harper's Ferry. The Count used a noticeably different tone in his writing as well. For the first time, a former Union military man and veteran of the war.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?